Well, welcome to our first session, which is the future of communication theory, plenary, or we could just call it the future of communication theory. And I want to start out with a word of explanation because this was an idea I had about a session that I thought would work well for this particular convention. And actually my initial inclination was to do the future of the field. In fact, Larry asked me why theory and not field in an email, and characteristically I didn't respond to him. But I will say now that I've been to quite a few sessions at communication conferences on the history of the field, where many people complain about how the field's going to hell, and some people say, no, it's okay. But overall, I thought that's kind of boring and played out. And also, I think much more interesting to consider, especially within this context, communication theory. And I want to start by saying that, for me, it has a special meaning because when I started as an undergraduate in my first semester, enrolling as a biology major, not knowing that I wouldn't be able to handle chemistry and all of that, I just kind of almost randomly picked a course as an elective called Introduction to Communication Theory. And while I didn't know at the time that this would somehow be significant in my future, I did greatly enjoy the course and found concept after concept being introduced absolutely fascinating and very much resonating with my own way of looking at things. And that course was taught by Jack Barwind, who this was at Cornell University. He was a young faculty member there. And he was the kind of professor who would take his class out to Johnny's Big Red for beer and say, let's have class here instead. Of course, the drinking age was 18 then, but I didn't tell him I was only 17. But he then went on to Syracuse, and I'm not sure where else, but I mean, he did wind up at Metropolitan, State, most recently, co-edited an anthology with Karen and Mike Mansour, and sadly passed away. And so I want to dedicate this session to him. And so,
it's the equivalent of dying with your boots on. He was teaching and online.
Well, so I do want to dedicate this session to him, and interest and to note, I mean, I've also was asked earlier this morning if this session would be at all interesting for someone who wasn't in the field of communication, and of course MEA is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary group. Actually, Sheila asked me that. Is Sheila here? Yeah, so I imagine you don't think it's very interesting so far because I'm just, but hopefully at the end maybe you can let us know. And I did want to say that Jack Barwin's introductory survey course on communication theory introduced me to many things that I would later know in media ecology. And not by that name, but many of the components that would make up media ecology. And then on the flip side, when I started as a doctoral student at NYU in Neil Postman's media ecology program, in the first semester, we read, it was a book-oriented program. We did not read one book on what is typically thought to be media. All of the readings were on information theory, cybernetics, systems theory, symbolic interaction, relational theory, like Watzlawick, general semantics, linguistics, all that sort of thing that I think is typically associated with the field of communication. And while a lot of it has been forgotten, if you look at what Postman was writing about during the 70s, before he became well known as a television critic. A lot of what he was writing about was language and interpersonal communication and relationships. So this is why I think this is of significance and a worthwhile session for us here at the MEA. And I want to start with Robert Craig from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and that's because Bob is involved in an encyclopedia of communication theory and philosophy. Is that the correct name?
That's right.
Yes, and also published a very significant article on communication theory in the journal Communication, called Communication Theory, some years ago, but that really covered a lot of the bases in the area. And you know, part of what I want to throw out is there really such a thing as communication theory? Is there still such a thing? Is it proper to talk about it as theory? I mean, we still have textbooks that say communication theory, but others that say theories in the plural of communication. How do you see it, Bob?
Well, I see it as a very plural field. I think well, actually, let me just pause and ask a question about format, okay? Are you wanting like short answers, like a minute, or I mean, I've actually prepared remarks that speak more or less to that question.
Then please go ahead.
Then please go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't want to. This is agenda as medium, right? We speak through the agenda, and that shapes the form of the message that we're going to convey. But yeah, I find that as I get older, I'm more frequently on panels about the future, which is, I think, ironic, you know, in a sense. I mean, I at this point know an incredible amount about the past of communication theory, not so much about the future. But I do think about the future a lot, and this question of is there such a thing as communication theory has been very much on my mind, because in that 1999 essay that Lance alluded to, I began with the observation that there is no field of communication theory. It's not a field, and the evidence of that is that people in the field, so-called, don't really have much to say to each other. They pretty much operate within their own domains of work. They have very little sense of the whole, and this then raises a question as to what is the whole. And in that essay and elsewhere, I've argued that there could be a whole to the field. There could be a sense of the field as a whole, but in order to see that, we have to, for one thing, relax in some ways our concept of what a theory is, because what theory is to people is quite different depending upon the kind of work that they do and the sort of specialty area that they're in. And so for a number of years I've articulated this notion of a practical discipline, that communication, to think of communication as a field that mission to cultivate the practice of communication in society. And that practice of communication is something that is culturally emergent. In other words, what we mean by communication, we sort of begin by looking around us and ask, what does communication mean to the people who think they're engaged in it? And in other words, it's a practical cultural concept. And one of the things that's happened historically over the last century or so is that a lot of our human activities have been kind of pulled into that concept and are framed as being communication in one way or another. And so thinking about that cultural practice and how the sort of intellectual study, criticism, research, and theorization of communication can contribute to cultivating that practice, both in a both in a normative sense of how do we envision communication ideally, what should it be, and in a technical sense of contributing.
Thanks, Bob. That was great. And I mean, you mentioned Carrie, who was a very significant part of our early years in this organization, and we would certainly embrace his definition of communication. And it also brings to mind that along with those other sort of non-typical media ecology scholars was Edward T. Hall, who wrote about nonverbal communication. We also included Ray Birdwhistle, but Hall and also about intercultural communication. And back in the 50s, he wrote, "Culture is Communication." Carrie kind of turned that on its head and said that, and wrote communication as culture. So speaking of that kind of cultural point of view brings to mind Larry Frey, who is sitting next to me, and Larry is also from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and kind of a longtime member of the MEA. Actually, the first person to run for president of the National Communication Association, listing MEA as one of his one of the associations he belongs to, which is probably why he lost, but we don't like to talk about that. But Larry does a lot of work on group communication and activism, and I know that you take a very progressive view on both the research and also on communication theory itself. So I was wondering if that informs your idea of communication theory, or as something that is subject to kind of continual change and renewal.
Well, thank you, Lance, and thank you for putting this together. I'll make a few statements, too, following on Bob's model. I'm not a communication theorist per se, although I often play one in real life. I've also bought into the view of theory that the television detective Charlie Chan once wrote, that theory is like a mist on the eyeglasses. It tends to obscure one's vision. So I'm not sure where I fit in on the communication theory side, but as a good researcher, I started to do some investigating about what are the communication theories out there, and looked at a lot of different sources, and there's certainly no shortage of communication theories. When I was growing up in the discipline, everybody complained there are no communication theories. We're borrowing them from all other disciplines, and sure, we continued to do that, but if you look at, for example, Littlejohn and Foss's Encyclopedia of Communication Theory, which came out in 2009, that contains more than 400 entries that are categorized into 17 general topics. It contains 560 theorists that are listed. I'll buy it. Not all of them are in communication, but a good number of them are. It would be hard to argue, I think, at this point in time that communication theory is not alive and well in the communication discipline. Some might argue that the explosion of communication theories and the wealth of specialty areas in which those theories have developed represents, fragmentation. I'm not necessarily of that opinion. I did do a search of the terms future, communication, and that yielded about 247 articles from the Communication and Mass Media Complete Database. If you add theory in the title, it yielded only 4 articles, and 70 articles only if you put it into the all text. Virtually all of those articles about the future of communication and the future of communication theory, at least in the last 10 years or so, have focused pretty much on specific theories. So whether that's Marxist theory or some other theory, or on specialized areas of communication, such as instructional communication or feminist communication, or on particular areas of the world, such as in Asia. So what struck me from all of those searches was the explosion of communication theories, coupled with the lack of general discussion regarding either the future of the communication discipline or the future of communication theory more specifically. Many of us, I'm sure, remember the kind of Furman in the field battles that characterize the study of communication, the laws, systems, rules, debates, or the communication rhetoric or communication media debates in the 70s and 80s. And then there's the theory application battles that took place in the 1990s, seemed to ignore the interrelationship of those practices, and certainly Bob has been one of the people at the forefront of bringing those together. Kind of, we forgot about Lewin maintaining that there's nothing so practical as a good theory, of course, which was later complemented by Claude Lévi-Laboyère's edition, that there's nothing so theoretical as a good application. Although I've always sided a little bit with Yogi Berra there, who said that in theory there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. You know, fortunately, those growing pain battles that the discipline had to experience, in which essentially what communication scholars did was say, look, one, the field is in a state of disarray. Two, I have a theory. And three, follow me, kind of a Monty Python routine there. Those things are behind us now, and we've gotten down to the business, I think, of constructing and testing communication theories. When Bob was interviewed in a 2013 essay published in the journal Communication Theory, one part of that essay focused on his thoughts regarding the future of communication theorizing, and he kind of spelled that out here today. But otherwise, you have to go back to about 2008 to find an article by Susan Herbst titled Disciplines, Intersections, and the Future of Communication Research, which was an introduction to a special issue of the Journal of Communication. And before that, to a 2000 piece by Stan Dietz to find the type of general future of communication article that seems so typical during the decades that I grew up in the communication field. So I believe that there never has been kind of a healthier time for communication theories per se. At the same time, you know, we don't seem to have the kinds of discussions about what is the future of communication theory writ large and the discipline itself. I think that paradoxically, in some ways, the differentiation of theories into the many categories in some areas might well lead to more theories that cut across categories. The one example I would point to is what Lance mentioned, and that is the communication activism for social justice perspective that I've tried to articulate over the years, because I think that that perspective essentially says that, look, it doesn't matter what areas of the discipline you come from. Certainly they all contribute in the sense that we can ask the question, to what extent are we bringing our resources, and by resources I mean our theories, our methods, our pedagogies, our other practices to bear to try to promote social justice. Activism is fundamentally a communication accomplishment, right? I mean, I know what a communication approach to social justice is, to activism for that. I don't know what it means to have a psychological approach. I don't know what it means to have a sociological approach. I wonder at times, what does it mean to have a media ecology approach to activism? One of the things I don't think that we've done very well with is sort of illustrating and illuminating the practical aspects of the constitutive process of communication. We've done a great job in many ways, certainly in applied comm, of looking at how we can translate or apply the information transmission perspective. But when we start, and you know, when we talk about communication as a constitutive process, that relationships, groups, whatever they are constituted in communication, we don't have a good way of talking about that. We don't have a good way of illustrating that. We don't have a good way of teaching that. I don't think our theories have really elaborated on what kind of even exercise would you use to demonstrate communication as a constitutive process, whether that's, again, in media ecology or in some other area of the discipline. So I'm hopeful that that will be the future, that we will work on that. Certainly, again, Bob has been at the forefront of trying to illuminate that, but we need more people who will work on that aspect of communication theory.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Next, I'd like to turn to Karen Lollar, who you've probably know who she is, but again, she's here at Metropolitan and is also running this convention. And in a way, it's a shame that Frank Dance couldn't be with us, because I think he would probably have some good things to say. So in part, I want to ask you, what would Frank say to all of this? But yeah, and of course, Frank Dance is kind of the father, can we still say father, of human communication. If some of you may recall that I'd say the one thing that Ong does wrong in orality and literacy is at the end he suggests that we shouldn't use the term media, but instead use human communication. I think I saw Frank's hand in that. From the point of view of human communication, and I think that very much represents that tradition of speech, which is so much about practice. Do we really say speech theory? I know we say rhetorical theory, but perhaps not speech theory. So, how does that all come into play from your point of view?
I guess I'm one of those interdisciplinary people. I did not start off as a communication scholar or a media ecology scholar. I started off also in biology and actually did do all the sciences and the math with that. Ended up with a degree in nursing. So I started off a systems theorist. And my whole undergraduate experience was understanding how everything affects the health of the whole, which is why this fits so nicely with media ecology. From there, I went on to the dark side and did an MBA. And that also was a lot about systems, but from a very different perspective. So when I started studying with Frank Dance at the University of Denver, it was a very nice fit because I understood it from a health systems perspective, which many theorists probably in this room don't see it quite that way. But one of the things that I really think we're lacking is a real practical application beyond ourselves. I think other disciplines have been much better spokespeople out to the world at large about the importance of what they're studying. And I think what we study, both as media ecologists or as communication scholars, is very, very important to what's going on in the world right now. But nobody's heard of us. And so somehow we're missing the connection, and yet we understand connections. So there's a little a problem there. I've been teaching a course on speech and thought over the last several years. And the more I teach it and the more I study that particular angle, and Frank and I have certainly talked about that, the more I realize that we frequently put that word speech out there and we say, oh, we don't need to talk about that anymore. I think more than ever we need to be talking about speech and how it relates to thinking, because I think we're losing thinking in some of what's going on in this ecology of our current digital media environment. I think a digital media ecology alters the processes, meanings, norms, expectations, and conditions of speaking and thinking. For example, I have students who tell me that they just asked their significant other for a divorce on a text message. I mean, that just blows my mind, okay? So there's a norm there that is somewhere in flux. And so we're losing a sense of the ethics of speaking and the ethics of thinking. So when we're working with our students, it is my hope that what we can give to them is an understanding about how every word is important, and that the words we choose are very important, and that there's a big difference between LOL and talking with somebody about a particular emotion. Those are significantly different meanings, and we're losing some sense of that meaning. So I agree that I think we need to take a critical stance, and we need to be looking at what's going on and be the people who are saying, wait a minute, this could be problematic, and help others to see some of the things that we do. One of the things that we've been talking about is free speech. We haven't talked about it in this conference, but certainly in our department. And we have a rhetoric concentration within our discipline. And so free speech is something that we teach our broadcasting majors. Freedom of speech is what they take as their senior experience. And I think everyone in this room would agree that that's a value that we hold very, very strongly in Western culture. But some of the new meanings and some of the restrictions that are occurring because we can restrict things through media are challenging what free speech really is. When I read about kids in elementary schools getting suspended because they were playing cowboys and whatever they play today, but they used this example, they took their finger and they were expelled. I'm saying, wait a minute, what are we doing here? I think we need to challenge some of what's going on culturally. I think true freedom of speech is not irresponsibly saying whatever comes to mind, which is what I see a lot of on social media, but instead it is contributing to the decision process that shapes our society. It is being thoughtful and articulate and conscious of what we're saying and how it interfaces with what other people are saying and how it contributes to the whole. I think social media opens up global communication. I'm actually talking on my paper on Sunday about a social media site that I'm part of. And it can create an increase in thoughtful deliberation, but it doesn't. So far, except maybe in some intellectual communities, I'm not seeing that that's generally how they're being operated. Opinions, emotions, superficiality are dominating a lot of the public sphere. And I think that's something we should look at. What does that mean to us? Speaking and thinking, for me, are an essential characteristic of the human experience. And I think that is what I see as what we as communication scholars can point out. We can enhance it. We can help people be conscious of who they are as human beings and what their talk means and how it contributes to that culture.
Thank you, Karen. Certainly some good food for thought and for direction. With that, I'd like to note that Janet Sternberg, like myself, was a graduate of Neil Postman's program and has been somewhat of an advocate of that other side of media ecology that in particular includes the study of social interaction and relationships, which also is something that we associate with another graduate of the program, Joshua Meyerowitz, who instead uses the term medium theory to talk about his approach to media ecology, which combines social interaction and technologically mediated communication. So, Janet, I wonder what your thoughts are on the communication theory as you're more centered in media ecology than in communication theory.
Hi. Lance's introduction of my perspective makes reference to a distinction I've written about that I call the yin and yang of media ecology. And the short version is the yang side, which relates to, in traditional Chinese symbolism, to the male, to the light, to the prominent, to the dominant. I see as involving technologies like film, radio, television, digital media. I think of them as the objects, the toys. Then there's what I've called the yin side of media ecology, which harkens back to the more traditional communication studies, titles like speech communication, human communication, rhetoric, language studies, not linguistics, because as a person with a master's in linguistics, I can tell you they know very little about human communication. And also the nonverbal communication. The kind of shift that we need to shift away from the focus on the yang part of media ecology and to give more prominence to the yin. Today, I don't want to make any predictions really about communication theory. What I'd like to do is just share with you my little wish list in the current heavily digitized digital environment that we live in. And I wrote these wishes out before I came here and before I had any idea of what these people were going to talk about. And I'm absolutely thrilled that many of the things they mentioned seem to fit right in with my wish list, at least the way I see it. To me, whether we call something a theory or a science or a field or a law, I see it as a focus of attention, what we pay attention to as scholars. And so my first wish is that we should pay less attention to entertainment and more attention to human communication. And here I'm thinking that we need fewer reviews of book versions of films, of comic books, we have so much of that already in the culture. And we have areas in the culture like healthcare. I was thrilled to hear you talk about your background in nursing because medical care is an area where people desperately need help in improving their communication skills. So that would be my first wish, that we would do a little less of the more media studies. Let's focus on the content and the latest new toy. We don't really need new models of smartphones. We do need new models of social justice and activism that focus on people's abilities to communicate with each other, not necessarily face-to-face, also using the vast array of digital technologies we have. But when we focus only on the glittering technological toys of tomorrow, we lose gradually our ability to communicate face-to-face because that takes practice. And if young people don't learn those skills, I'm wondering what kind of culture we're going to end up with. So that's my first wish. My second, let me just continue a little bit with that first wish. Less attention to images and sound and more attention to words. Again, this is pretty much what one of the things Karen was saying. We've often heard that parental expression to troubled children, use your words. Our culture needs help with our words. Doctors don't communicate well with patients. People of different cultures, different linguistic backgrounds. We have tremendous refugee problems around the world. We have areas of burning need where people need help with their words. We've been working a lot on the images and the sounds and the animations. Let's get back to the words, because until we do better with the words, I don't think there's much hope for the culture. My second and third wishes are much shorter and related. My second wish is less attention to profit, more attention to nonprofit. The big corporations already have plenty of money. The governments, nonprofit organizations of all kinds. We have disaster after disaster around the world caused by human stupidity, but also caused by, natural disasters. And communication is at the foundation of coordinating and understanding and sharing information about many of these situations. And if we could do so with less attention to which headline is going to grab the audience's attention and more attention to which headlines need to be shared in order for the world to progress a little better, I think we would do better. That idea ties in with my third wish is I wish we had a lot more attention to the public interest and a lot less attention to corporate interests. I really don't care what new device Silicon Valley is introducing next week. I care about the fact that there are millions of people suffering from diabetes in this country who go home from the hospital unable to understand the medical care they have to follow through in. That's a communication problem. They need help. That's important. If they don't get that help, they're going to die. If we don't get a new smartphone, we're not going to die. So fewer new tech toys, more improvements in the human condition, more attention to social justice, to activism, to using all these fantastic tools that we have. They're not just toys, but if all we do is use them to entertain ourselves, we want to entertain ourselves part of the time, but when that becomes the number one cultural priority, let's entertain ourselves in ways that will be most profitable to large corporations. Communication theory then becomes moot, or as one of my students once said, mute, which actually is a clever pun, because if communication theory is irrelevant, if we have nothing useful to offer people except critiques of content, really, if we don't go back to some of the basics that are being forgotten because they're not as sexy. Teaching speech 101 and rhetoric is not, the kids don't want to do it. It's not as glam as teaching a digital media course where you're going to learn video editing. But when I ask myself, what do young people in particular need? They don't need help with video editing. They do that on their own. They do need help with learning eye-to-eye contact, face-to-face communication, because they're not getting much practice with that. So those are my wishes, and it sounds, based on what I've heard so far, like a lot more people than I imagined may share these wishes too.
Thank you, Janet. Just laughing about the microphone being passed along. It certainly seems to be a lot of synergy on this session, which is great. And next up is Corey Anton, and I imagine he is going to speak to a lot of these points that have already been made. Corey is very much centered in the field of communication, and in one of his main influences, who he's recently been writing about, Lee Thayer, constitutes one of several. There's been like a number of these kind of pockets of people who were doing media ecology even when they weren't using that term, but bringing together many of the same kinds of sources, that the interconnections between systems theory, symbolic interaction, relationships, and the kind of study of media that McLuhan and others pioneered. Corey is also the vice president of the Institute of General Semantics and has a strong connection to that area. General semantics refers to itself as a discipline, not as a theory, which is sort of interesting, and perhaps you could also speak to that, but I know that you want to address the distinction between information, which is, again, there is an information theory, which in some ways precedes the idea of communication theory when Claude Shannon introduces an idea of information theory just when communication departments were being formed right after World War II all over America. It was initially latched onto as a paradigm and then lost or pushed aside for its inadequacies, but I think that is in part gave rise to the idea of searching for there being a communication theory. But there is a distinction between information and communication that I know you want to speak to.
Thank you very much. I'm just coming through. I'm very honored to be on here this session, and I really resonated with so many of the things that people have said. I want to say a couple of things. First, on this question of multidisciplinarity and the problem with disciplinization of knowledge. It makes deans happy. Doesn't necessarily, it's not conducive to learning or to scholarship. I think one of the bitter truths for people who study communication is that they have to accept that some of the most brilliant insights about communication come from people who don't necessarily have degrees in communication. That if you're going to have a theory of molecular biology or a theory of physics, it's very likely to come from a molecular biologist or a physicist. But theories of communication come from all disciplines because all disciplines have to deal with communication problems and information problems. So I think one of the issues is communication is an inherently multidisciplinary field. It's not a discipline, and I think that's one of the things that, you know, it's a continued struggle. The question about what is the difference between information theory and communication theory, I think, to me, that's really at the heart of almost all of this discussion. And it's also related to, I think, it's, again, another ugly truth, is that the notion of context is probably the most inadequately understood concept in all of the sciences and all of the humanities. And it's a bugbear in information theory. It poses all kinds of problems, really going all the way back to the history of literacy. And I think when Ong raises the question of what is context-free information and how does literacy introduce something like context-free, I think that's a thread to go back to of how do we differentiate communication theory from information theory. So I think communication theory has to do with speech, with the particulars, with the local context of gesticulating, living, and dying organisms. And the definition of communication that I really prefer comes from Amardo Rodriguez. He came and he visited Grand Valley some years ago, and he said, I define communication as the habit and practices by which we become vulnerable to the humanity of others. It's the habits and practices by which we become vulnerable to the humanity of others. So many of these communication technologies, they're information technologies, and they're by and large vulnerability management tools. That's what these are. They're tools to help people learn how to manage vulnerability. And I think a lot of this has to do with a fundamental equivocation over the difference between communication and information. It would take us, you know, well beyond what we can do here. I do think Richard Lanigan has done a lot of stuff on trying to differentiate information theory from communication theory. Information theory is a subset of communication theory, and I think what happened was as literacy set in, information became more and more real. It became like a substance, and in the wake of that, I mean, try to think of this just for a moment to try to think back of it. I think we all agree that all organisms, they communicate. And when we ask the question of where did human communication begin? Where does language begin? It's fascinating. Tool use goes back arguably 2.5 million years. Fire goes back 1 million years. I don't know a reputable language scholar who will put language back 1 million years. Most people, some people, Jared Diamond, they'll put it as far back as 100,000. Most people I know are going to place it somewhere about 40 or 30,000, but the explosion doesn't really happen until about 10,000 years ago. It's literacy which introduced information, and once information became a meta-communicative concept that became a regulative practice within communication, it started to make communication over in the image of information. Now, to such an extent that people get together and they imagine all they're doing is sharing information. They've forgotten that they are a living, dying organism in negotiating their vulnerability in a shared living context. So I guess I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Well, easy thing to forget, I suppose. I think we've have a lot of ferment for further discussion. I want to throw out one thing before we get into that, because I want to just bring it back to that question of theory and what is theory, which is actually something that Bob started out with, and you know, that in some ways theory is a term that we associate strongly with the sciences. And you know, if we go through this, you know, science education, I think we learn that you have a theory, a theory, an overarching theory, and then you have hypotheses derived from those theories, and you test out those hypotheses, and that's the way the sciences, the hard sciences, proceed. The social sciences and behavioral sciences then are modeled along those lines, but in not completely successfully. I mean, it was just recently a case where somebody actually did replicate someone's study. I forgot the fellow's name, but they found out that it was all made up. I'm sorry? Do you know it? Well, yeah, I can't. But, and James Carey, I remember making the point, you know, talking about culture's communication, that you can't really do scientific research on the scale, on the macro level of societies. It's like you can't have a test where you have a control nation equivalent to the United States, but without television, and see what the differences are. You know, we can't do that, which is why he wanted to shift the discussion from effects to function, because you can't prove anything that way. Along with that, I think a lot of, or certainly some of our key scholars have rejected the term theory in media ecology as scientism, a form of scientism. Postman rejected it. McLuhan would say, I'm not doing theory, I'm not trying to prove anything, I just probe. Also, I think Walter Ong, perhaps the most insightful criticism, points out that theory is the root meaning is visual, similar to idea being the same root as video, and that is a visual metaphor for thinking and for discourse, and rejected it on those grounds. But interestingly enough, we see at the same time that in that ferment period from the 70s on, the humanities that at first, you know, had nothing to do with theory, then went into trying to do science, like I.A. Richards, you know, trying to actually be scientific, and then later on, sort of in the kind of post-structuralist era, kind of took the word theory, but used it in this looser sense. And I think that's where we have now rhetorical theory. I don't think rhetoricians used to call what they did theory, and literary theory, but it's used in a way that's different from the kind of social science and scientific background. And I just recently had a discussion on curriculum where the folks in our department from the humanities really balked at the idea of terms like research and method. And we sort of took for granted, you have a methods, we should have a methods course, and they're like, we don't have methods, right? You know, so that these terms become alien, that we associate, coming from this other point of view, with theory. So I wanted to just throw that out, because in a sense the future of theory is theory the way to look at this. Joshua Meyerowitz used medium theory because he was trying to present a form of media ecology in a way that would be acceptable in social science and behavioral science. But do we want that, or is that something better left by the wayside? So I want to, Bob, you want to?
Yeah, so what is theory? I mean, I think we need to recognize that you can offer various definitions of theory. I think it's important to understand that theory is closely related to certain kinds of practices. In other words, that say in the field of theoretical physics, they're engaged in certain sorts of intellectual conceptual practices, and in that environment, theory has a particular meaning. If we look at literary theorists, as Lance pointed out, they'll use the term theory, but what they mean by theory is quite different, and is very much related to their practice as literary theorists, and the same as we look at other disciplines. So, I think that all of these different senses of theory do have some things in common. We're talking about some sort of symbolic expression. We're talking about abstraction. We're talking about some sense of intellectual rigor and care in the development of concepts and so forth. But the nature of that rigor is going to differ depending on the practice that it's serving. And this brings me back a little bit to the idea of communication as a practice, and how does it make sense to think of theory in that context? And one of my sources of inspiration is Aristotle, and his notion of he made a distinction between different forms of knowledge. What he might call theory, or theoretical knowledge, would be most closely related to the formal disciplines and science. But when he wrote about ethics and politics, he was also doing theory. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes a very important observation when he says that we ought to try to achieve as much precision as the subject matter allows. And in the case of human ethics and moral conduct, that level of precision is going to be quite a bit lower than it is in physics, or something. But nevertheless, theory in that context can have a kind of usefulness in the sense that this is still referring to Aristotle here, that once a person has achieved a certain degree of maturity and experience, reflecting on their action becomes an important thing to do, and ethical theory, or more generally, what I would call practical theory, is about food for reflection on what we do, resources to reflect on what we're doing, and to think about what we ought to be doing, and so it's a different kind of theory, that's all. And I think that scientific theory also potentially in fact, does clearly have a role to play in that. We're a multidiscipline. We also, therefore, we're engaged in a variety of intellectual practices. Therefore, we work with a variety of different concepts of theory. And certainly the classic model of scientific theory is pursued in our discipline, and I think it has a contribution to make. But it's not the kind of the bottom line fundamental thing in my view.
Can I jump on that real quick? I think there is a really important distinction between, we just changed our communication it was called theories of communication. We just changed it to communication theory. And I think it's related to this question of what is mediacology. I think there are theories of communication. It's often, as Larry's identifying, it's testable. They're specific. They're context particular. They may have a particular application, and they could be discipline specific. Whereas I think when I think about communication theory, or as I'm trying to introduce students into what communication theory is, it's trying to get them, sort of as you're saying, Bob, to realize the very historicity of the human condition, and it's to provide resources for reflection upon that. And so it's because to be human is to always be caught in a network of historical and social sort of constituted relations. It's those themselves that require, I guess, reflection back upon those. And you can't think about the past. You can't reconstruct it and make sense of it without theorizing. We're naturally theoretical beings to the extent that we're historical.
Yeah, I'll jump on that too. I think that there has been a long dominant discourse of theory, as a good friend of mine, Barnett Pierce, used to say, as kind of a disembodied, ahistorical, law-like statements on God's own chalkboard in the sky. That kind of theory, I think we have fairly rejected in the communication discipline to develop the kinds of practical theories that Bob is talking about. At the same time, I want to sort of critique ourselves in that while we can engage in the same kind of theorizing about the human condition, which of course is incredibly important, the question that I would pose is what practical communicative aspects or practices are we engaged in to actually change that? Theory itself, or conceptualizing, doesn't, by definition, change material conditions. It just doesn't. That there has to be some kind of intervention into those discourses in order to achieve the kinds of goals that people are talking about here. And so to the extent that we as scholars stay in the theoretical realm, it's quite likely that none of the things that were talked about in terms of, stopping poverty or human trafficking or, realizing the human potential, none of those things will be accomplished per se. So I would pose the question, what difference are we actually making? What could we point to? There are things we probably could, but they tend to pale in comparison to the kind of conceptual richness of the way in which we've conceived the world.
Okay. Are there, from what we've discussed so far, would any of you like to follow up on a specific point, or should we turn it over to the peanut gallery for comments or questions? You want questions? Are you sure you can handle them, Corey? Yeah. Okay. There are are they supposed to step up to those microphones? There are microphones on both sides. Are they working? If you'd like to step up to the microphone, or just yell out from where you are if anyone has a question or comment to make. There's a hand up there. Yes, sir. Well, just one second. And were you able to get that? Or should I read? Well, I won't repeat the question, but I'll just state that the question is on the topic. Okay, the question's on the topic of political correctness, which, in fact, the communication theory had something to do, in the idea of words having power, and that now there is a backlash against political correctness, and that's what the panelists are asked to address. Corey.
I think there's three real quick factors. I've been talking about this issue a lot lately, and I think one is that children are increasingly raised with, parents who really care and give attention to them and stress their centrality and their importance in society in a way that previous generations kids were sort of to be seen, not heard. The other is that there is an increasing differentiation of people, that people are micro-siloed in information environments, and then it's the Edward Hall point, that there is a loss of overall context. When the loss of context happens, you end up with most of the meaning being in the code rather than the context. People become increasingly literal. You can't rely upon people understanding jokes. Jokes get really misunderstood because there's no longer a shared context. See, some of this stuff is David Shank's stuff on the context of no context. Information is so liquidated a common context that political correctness is the natural outcome of hyperliterality.
Would anyone else like to? Okay. Other questions? Back there. Okay, I just restate the question. That the question is regarding the distinction between yin and yang of media ecology, how that relates to McLuhan's hot and cool, and the distinction between context and information.
Is it still on? Good. The best answer I can give it is an example. When digital recording first came along, everybody was thrilled about the ability to make digital mixes. You could produce types of music and sound that you could not produce in the physical analog world. You could do it with digital means. But after a while, people started to feel sort of nostalgia for the analog imperfections that the old-fashioned analog tape to vinyl recording system had. And so what you found is that some of the digital artists were trying to reintroduce analog imperfections into the music to make it sound more, quote-unquote, real. And I think part of that is has to do with the idea that when things are digital and so perfect, there's nothing left for us to fill in. And I think that's part of what McLuhan was getting at with the hot and cool distinction, is the level to which the perceiver is filling in information that is part of the context. And more recently, I've heard about a new practice with people who are enjoying music. One of the charms of the iPod was that you could listen to any one song in the order you wanted to. You were no longer tied to the order that the artist imposed when the artist issued a vinyl record, for example. Well, now some people have returned to the practice of listening to analog records, not just for the imperfection, but because they want to share the experience that the artist may have originally intended. I want the songs to be heard in this sequence. I want the record flip to happen at this point in the 12 songs. I want these songs to be on separate sides of the album. Older people may remember how relevant that that might have been to your listening pleasure. The idea that the digitized ability to customize your listening experience so that it can be perfect and it can be just my listening experience seems it seems to fall and flatten the culture. And I think McLuhan's hot, and I don't want to say it's hot or it's cool. I just think the notion of there's nothing to fill in. If everything's given to you and there's no context, you listen to the one song unrelated to the album and to the surrounding songs. People are thirsting for the context, and I think we're seeing new practices where people are reintroducing the appreciation of let's share this context together, not just consume this mediated product on our own.
I'll just add real quick that I think in my book Echoes and Reflections, I just note that Edward T. Hall's distinction between high and low context cultures parallels McLuhan's hot and cool. So, high context is cool and low context is hot. I think we have time for one more question. I saw one more hand up. I can't see it now. Ed.
I seem to have the microphone in my hand, even though I don't necessarily have an answer. You're sort of asking about like communication theory across the curriculum, sort of, as it's taught in different subjects. Well, I think that in a communication curriculum, well, it's a problem because if you try to teach all of it, it's just overwhelming, and you get jerked from one intellectual orientation to another one, and it doesn't have a kind of consistency to it. What I've tried to think about is this notion that I was developing of models of communication are also models for communication. And although these theories came from a lot of different disciplines, if you think of historically about the times and conditions under which they arose, this kind of interest in communication that emerged in a lot of different disciplines had something to do with the way that those disciplines thought about what they had to do with society, right? In other words, the interest in communication is a kind of practical interest, like how do we make it better or how do we solve problems? And so what I've tried to argue in this sort of model of the field that I've developed is that we can have a conversation about theory that tries to extract from these different disciplines the sort of fundamental practical orientation toward communication and the sort of problems of communication that each of those orientations reveals and speaks to, and so what you're trying to do with students is develop a kind of broad repertoire of ways of framing communication problems, ways of understanding what a communication problem is, recognizing them and thinking about using the theories as resources for thinking about what to do. So if you kind of you try to put it all on that level, right? It has a little bit more consistency potentially, and sort of meaningfulness to students.
It's a difficult question to answer. I guess one of the concerns that I would have is that we tend to teach comm theory in a very top-down sort of manner, as if here's the theories and now let's apply them to our experiences. And it is true that if you look at most syllabi, they're If it's Tuesday, it's uncertainty reduction theory. You know, if it's Thursday, it's another symbolic interaction theory, suddenly shifting paradigms. What we don't have is a very good model of a kind of experiential approach to that, what I talked about before, of a constitutive kind of model of how we would teach that. I do that through the communication activism lens of giving people experiences of being immersed in activism, and then from there trying to conceptualize, in a sense, what are the practices that they engaged in, what are the kinds of communication techniques and tools, et cetera, that they used. You could do that in virtually any course. You could certainly do that in interpersonal communication course. I do that there, of immersing people in an experience without the lenses first, and then trying to develop the kinds of lenses, rather than telling them what those lenses are, having them construct the kinds of explanations that would get to them having some conception about what that experience was, what it produced, what it led to, what the nature of the relationship is based on that. But I just don't think we approach it that way. I did just do a book here the last year called Teaching Communication Activism, Communication Education for Social Justice, that essentially takes that kind of approach, but it's a pretty narrow slice in terms of looking at it from a kind of comm activism lens. There are other lenses we could certainly do that with.
I wanted to say something about comm theory in the curriculum. In our program, communication theory is one of 4 required core courses. It is second in the series of core courses, and what we have worked with our faculty to accomplish is a scaffolding of information from the comm theory course into every other course that they take subsequent or after that. And so that I have faculty members coming to me and they're giving me feedback on how their students are starting to understand the theories as they get it that second time. And one of the things when I teach the comm theory class, I know it's a survey class. It's like visiting Europe. You go to 20 different cities and you remember 2 of them, right? And so, and I use pretty much that analogy. But I ask the students to pick their four theories that really were meaningful to them, and so that they walk away remembering 4. And what we're finding is those are the 4 that they remember throughout their communication program. So it's scaffolded to reinforce it and have them apply it as they go higher up the scale.
I just want to add one other thing. I mean, if you think about what are students concerned about when they come to university and through their lives, they're concerned with things like, do people like me? Who am I? And I would pose, what do our communication theories say about that? Corey was talking a little bit about that in terms of vulnerabilities. We don't really deal with the kinds of issues that students are grappling with in college. Instead, we concern ourselves with content, which is important, no doubt, but it sort of ignores all of the kinds of developmental issues that are going on. What does communication have to say about, for example, personal growth? It's not really clear to me where we've developed theories about that. It's no wonder that we can't explain that very well. It's no wonder that we don't address it very well in our courses. I think that if we focused on those kinds of questions and really showed how those theories can, in fact, explain actions that people could take to find out, for example, whether people like them, we might have a whole lot more effects through our theories.
I'd like to thank our panelists, Janet Sternberg, Robert Craig, Corey Anton, Karen Lollar, Larry Frey, and I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Lance Strate. I think this has been a thought-provoking and panel with a lot of powerful ideas. And just one last thing, Sheila. Thumbs up, very good. Okay.